Welcome everyone to the second session of our panel, The House as Gothic Locus, the Uncanny and the United States Family, for the 50 Plus Shades of Gothic conference series organized by PopMech Research. Today we have an interesting set of 4 talks which revolve around a spooky theme, domesticity and the family institution in the context of the United States. I will introduce our wonderful speakers for today one by one before they present, and we will listen to their talks, and then we will leave a Q&A session for the end. Please bear in mind that this session is being recorded and will be uploaded onto YouTube. So if you do not wish to appear on the video, you can type your questions on the chat at the end. So now I remind the audience that you should keep your microphones muted and your cameras turned off while the speakers are presenting. And then you can turn them on at the end if you are asking a question, for which I kindly ask you to first use the raise hand button that you can find at the bottom of your screen. The speakers, however, can leave their cameras on while the other members of the panel are presenting their works. So if that's all clear, without delay, let me introduce the first speaker. Sofía Martinicorena is a predoctoral fellow at the English Studies Department of the Complutense University of Madrid. Sofía's main research lines revolve around contemporary United States literature and its national spatial imaginary. And today she's presenting a paper entitled Tracing Gothic Houses in US Culture. So the floor is yours, Sofía.
Thanks for that, Monica. Let me just share my presentation real quick. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Yep.
Cheers. Okay, so in today's presentation, I'm going to discuss how the Gothic representations of houses have been intimately related to national concerns in the US. And I'm going to focus especially on 20th century film culture. So I'm not so much interested in providing a thorough analysis of a single work, but rather on providing a genealogy or one possible genealogy of the pervasiveness of certain Gothic themes, which is the premise of this series anyways. So I'd like to mention as a disclaimer that not all of the works I'm discussing are Gothic, but all of them arguably contain Gothic elements. So I'm going to focus on the idea of the house as a repository or a catalyst for certain national anxieties. And I'm going to touch on 3 main topics that exemplify this idea. So I'm going to focus on the suburban Gothic, then on what Lenora Ledwin has termed the central enigma of the family, and then lastly on the Indian burial ground trope. So discussions on this tend to start up with Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, and that's a wonderful start. But today I wanted to focus instead on Hawthorne's The House of the Seven Gables, because I think it's another possible point of origin to talk about the importance of, themes of national anxiety. And in particular, Hawthorne in this novel, or romance in the American tradition, discusses themes of how there are certain anxieties that are literally arising from the land. And these anxieties impregnate the house that is erected upon this land. So I'm not going to dwell on this because it's well known, but I just wanted to mention it to see how these issues that I'm going to discuss actually harken back to, the 19th century when Hawthorne is writing, but also to earlier colonial settings, which is the time that Hawthorne is writing about. Here I have included a quote by Bernice Murphy that I wanted to read in relation to Hawthorne's text, because I think that it perfectly highlights this genealogy that I'm talking about. And it reads, suburban Gothic is a reenactment of the paradigm which informs so much of the American Gothic in general. Initial settlement and construction of an idealized community is succeeded by creeping disillusionment and the sense that all is not well. So obviously Murphy is talking about 20th and 21st century culture, but this applies as well to 19th century culture and to the earlier colonial setting. So we see how you can trace the pervasiveness of these fixations. So moving on to our first section, obviously one of the most prominent examples of houses that become the repository of national narratives is the ubiquitous suburban house. Suburban homes, especially in the post-war United States, were taken to be an emblem of the nation, as again Bernice Murphy has argued when she says that the suburbs were seen from the outset to have an innate connection with the very character of the nation itself. What is this character, though? Well, within the context of post-war economic prosperity, the suburban home became the proud emblem of the national democratization of housing opportunities for the middle class, and typically the white heteronormative family middle class, at least in terms of pop culture. And additionally, the post-war suburban home also became an emblem of anti-communism, which is why William Levitt, the developer of Levittown, one of the foundational post-war mass-produced suburbs, said that no man who owns his house and lot can be a communist because he has too much to do. So the identification of the suburban house with nationalist and traditional American values paved the way for Gothic manifestations of questions revolving around borders and frontiers, national and home security, and the permanent threat of another that lurks around the house, especially in the decade of the 50s. And so the deconstruction of the suburban sort of nationalism through the Gothic became soon a staple of US pop culture. So we can see examples of this in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which was released in 1956, and which combines this typical fear of typical post-war fear of invasion with their insecurities about the homogenization, which are so central to suburban developments. This fear of homogenization and the loss of identity is also present in a movie like The Stepford Wives, which also includes gender issues. This movie, which is based in a novel by Ira Levin, is about the story of several housewives from a perfect cookie cutter suburb, which are actually robots. So this has to do with another key feature of the suburban Gothic, which is its concern with how the suburbs have inscribed gender inequality and have reinforced normative family models. This was obviously an issue from the outset of suburban ideology, but the treatment of gender within the suburbs has not remained the same throughout the years. And it has sort of accompanied larger national debates. So we can see a transition from the early anxieties represented by Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique to other types of fears about women's place in society. About this, Carol M. Davidson has explained that this response to fears, and I quote, about the Equal Rights Amendment from 1972, second wave feminism, and such medical breakthroughs as the birth control pill, which disrupted established power relations by granting women more control over their bodies, unquote. So this is why franchises like John Carpenter's Halloween took an interest in the gender dynamics of the suburbs beyond the stereotype of the housewife. And in Halloween, for instance, you get different types of women. So you have this dichotomy between the final girl who gets to survive and then the girls who get killed in the first 10 minutes of the movie. So moving on to the family, the suburban ideology that we have been discussing also hinged very heavily on the weight of the heteronormative family. And Gothic fictions took to destabilizing this idea immediately, suspecting that families are also something that can go very, very wrong. It is in this respect that Lenora Ledwin has talked about the central enigma of the family, which she has defined as one key feature of the Gothic. And we can see this, for instance, in Rosemary's Baby, which is not a suburban fiction, but it takes place in the Dakota building, which is very Gothic in itself. And it also draws from this idea of the idealized young couple, the newlywed couple who wants to buy a house and start a new family. So this this iteration of the American dream soon goes very, very wrong, and we get a plot with satanic cults, fears and anxieties about motherhood and sexuality, and ultimately the presence of the devil. So going back in time a little, I wanted to mention Hitchcock's Psycho because of the time when it was released, and because for me it sort of marks, it's an important landmark in terms of US pop culture. It was released in 1960, and so it kind of marks a break with the decade of the 50s, which we have been discussing, and which was a very conservative decade that emphasized the post-war aspirations of a house that shelters its inhabitants from, the danger of threatening world outside. So what Psycho did in this respect was to introduce the idea that horror does not lie outside the house, but rather inside. And obviously in this movie, horror also revolves around the central enigma of the family. This is also not a suburban narrative, but Bernice Murphy has analyzed it in those terms, in terms of suburban culture, if you're interested. Now we fast forward again to a more recent show, and here we have Twin Peaks. Here, the trope of the family house as the locus of horror becomes materialized in the Palmer house. And I won't give away much more in case someone hasn't seen this, but here we can see the moment where Laura Palmer / Kerry Page encounters the sheer horror that is contained in her own family home. So what Twin Peaks is doing, among other things, is actually turning the idea of a happy family upside down. And in many ways, it does it through the depiction of the family home as an uncanny and dangerous place, in this case for Laura. So for those of you who haven't seen the show, one of the most disturbing images, for me at least, is the ceiling fan, which is an incredibly ordinary house device. But when you see it, you know that something horrible is about to happen. So, you know, it's this idea that the ordinary aspect of domesticity can also become a sign of, you know, the ominous. So in sum, I hope these examples that I brought show how the dream of happy domesticity that peaked in the 1950s has been consistently deconstructed through the Gothic use of the house. And moving on to my last point, I wanted to comment on this racist trope of the Indian burial ground as a major national anxiety of US pop culture. So we have seen this appear in a million movies. And if I'm not wrong, which I probably am, I think it was popularized in the Amityville Horror. But I wanted to focus instead on The Shining, because whereas in the Amityville Horror and in other movies, the fact that a house is erected upon Indian burial ground explains the mystery, at least to an extent. In The Shining, this detail has no bearing whatsoever for the movie's plot. So it's just like a Gothic prop to add to this Gothic ambience, or to, you know, give the hint that the house is potentially haunted, but it doesn't explain anything. So critics like Kevin Constantine or Joy Porter have argued that this trope has to do with the colonial guilt that arises from the violent dispossession of native peoples from their lands. But this meaning is erased in movies like The Shining, where we see that this huge traumatic historical issue that remains unresolved to this day has been fossilized as a pop culture prop that has been stripped from its political meaning. So in any case, even when this is the case, and when, you know, this sort of stripping from its political meaning happens, this trope shows how the image of a Gothic house can still be a powerful means to channel national and historical trauma, and to speak of issues like settler colonialism. So with that, I conclude my presentation, and I hope that I was able to show how pervasive the meanings that are attached to Gothic houses are in US fiction and movies, and the ways in which they are repeatedly used to code certain national anxieties and obsessions. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Sofía, for such a great presentation. I think it's a great start to this panel overview that might be helpful also in combination with the next presentations that we have. So without delay, I'm moving on to Kerry. Kerry Gorrill is a PhD student at Manchester Metropolitan University, and her research focuses on post-millennial narratives, where she traces the interaction of male protagonists with domestic settings. Her paper for today is entitled Monstrous Interiors, Domestic Space as the Ontological Terrorist of Toxic Masculinity. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Kerry. Oh, sorry, you're muted. Can you turn on your microphone now?
Hi, I'll just see if I can get my screen to share. I'm hoping I can. Oh, lovely. So,
we've seen that. Yeah.
Lovely. I'm just trying to get it to start. There we go. forgive me for the very lengthy and unwieldy title, but I've got a quote here, and these are words of Dr. Strange from the Marvel comic story, The House of Shadows, from 1964, which to me speaks to the development of what I see as a new variant of the Gothic haunted house setting and its relationship that it has with the male protagonist in American Gothic literature in particular. And what I want to argue is that this is a trope that develops to express a fundamental collapse in American masculinity that's so extreme that these very entrapped, troubled men are left with very few options except to consider their very existence as human beings. I'm going to be using R.D. Laing's theories of the schizoid subject to explore this development in the male protagonist, and also Gaston Bachelard's Poetics of Space to examine the nature of this new sentient space. Well, the motif of the haunted house or the castle has been part of Central Gothic literature from the outset, beginning with the 18th century and Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. But as Catherine Spooner points out in Contemporary Gothic, the Gothic operates like a malevolent virus, to quote her, and so it does update itself in very particular ways in modern and contemporary American Gothic texts. And we can see that, for example, in classics like Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. But my observation is that this new haunted house has emerged in a way that it's no longer just a setting to provide atmosphere and tension, but it's actually become a sentient, shape-shifting monster in its own right, a kind of existential terrorist that targets this new, very troubled male protagonist to reflect the very dramatic political and social upheaval of post-millennium America, in particular the rise of things like neoliberalism, the death of the manufacturing industries, debt, steel, coal, and also the subprime crisis in particular of 2008, and corresponding rise in Trumpism. So I first sort of became aware of this trope when I read House of Leaves by Danielewski in 2000. And if you know it, it's a very complex, massive work of metafiction that for me generated a whole new Gothic affect, this kind of unspecified, nihilistic, cosmic terror. And it unsettled me like no other text had before it. And that was what intrigued me. And tracking back, for me, this is not necessarily the first outing of the trope. The earliest example I can find is L. Ron Hubbard's novella Fear, which was published in 1941. But when you track back, you can see its origins beginning in the 1970s with classics like Stephen King's The Shining in 1977, Robert Marasco's Burnt Offerings in 1978. But where, for me, it really comes to fruition is the post-millennial text like Danielewski's House of Leaves in 2000, Steve Rajnik Thames' Deadfall Hotel in 2012, Jack Jemp's The Grip of It in 2017, and most recently, Sean Hamill's Cosmology of Monsters, which was published last year, that seem to reflect this perceived diminishment of the role and the status of the white male in contemporary American culture. So what I'm starting to notice as I've tracked the development of this trope is that there are some very, very key elements to it. So primarily what we need to have is the central presence of this schizoid male protagonist who's come from a very dysfunctional background. He brings with him a wife and usually a child with whom he shares this failing family fantasy, this shared unconscious ideal that they're all somehow striving to achieve between them. Their situation causes a removal to a kind of quasi-domestic space. So it's housed perhaps in a loose term as a kind of reference, a refuge from a real failure in terms of family, marriage and career. And once in that space then becomes sentient in response to their presence. And the interaction between them leads to the forcing of the protagonist into a very painful existential crisis, during which there's a very unreliable sense of time, place and memory. And what I'm starting to see develop is this sense of rhizomatic connection to deeper layers of history and almost at a cosmological level. So looking around at criticism of text like this, there's a lot been written on The Shining, Stephen Davenport, From Big Sticks to Talking Sticks, Steve Brooms on Stephen King's phallus. There are lots and lots of examples of critical writing about them. And there's a lot of relevant criticism that's to do with the role of the protagonist in representing American masculinity and the collapse of the family, and linking it to sort of key historical and social contextual factors of the period. But when you look at the analysis of Jack Torrance as the protagonist, it tends to be Freudian. It tends to be Lacanian. There's no real attempt to explore the reasons for the psychotic break, and they don't really look at the nature of the overlook or its role in driving that psychotic break. Looking at House of Leaves, and there's more and more written about that recently, most of the writing tends to focus on its metafictive qualities and its nihilistic nature. But there are critics like Fred Bochting and his horror space reading House of Leaves, and he's written very persuasively about the house as a labyrinth in House of Leaves, describing it as, he calls it a horror space, the kind of multiplication of spatial horror. Catherine Cox, in her chapter in the Palgrave Horror Handbook, Postmodern Labyrinths, Spaces of Horror Reimagined, recognises the house as actually directly responding to the presence of Will Davidson and sees it as having some level of sentience. And she describes the house as a reimagined maternal space, and also sees that it's something that's threatened that protagonist with an existential nothingness. Somebody that is particularly of interest, Andrew Hoksoon-Ung, in Conceptualizing Varieties of Space in Horror Fiction, explores the kind of space that you find in House of Leaves as a kind of Foucauldian heterotopia, and he starts to introduce some really interesting ideas from Deleuze about ideas of space to do with the plea or the fold. But most people tend to be focusing on the metafictive aspects and the typological aspects. But what we're starting to see is this recognition of this relationship between the protagonist and the sentient nature of the house. So for me, this new strand, this new male protagonist, isn't mad in that kind of grand guignol sense that you find in Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat, for example. I want to use the writings of R.D. Laing, in particular his work from his most famous work, The Divided Self, published in 1960, in which he describes the schizoid subject. Now, he describes him as someone who's ontologically insecure, somebody who's got, and I quote, a rent in his relations with his world and a disruption of his relation with himself. And he's described someone who is not able to, and I quote, experience himself together with others or be at home in the world. And he describes somebody who is forced to live in what he calls despairing aloneness and isolation. And he describes somebody who is not a complete person, somebody who is split in various ways, somebody who becomes almost dissociated from his body and exists often as two or more selves. So just to exemplify, I want to reference Jack Torrance in The Shining and Will Davidson from House of Leaves, just to give an idea from the beginning and the midpoint of the development of this trope. So when we compare them, we can see that they are satisfying some of these key elements of the trope. They both come from dysfunctional families. Jack's father is physically and emotionally abusive. Will's father is an alcoholic who's often absent, and his mother abandons them. We see that both of them have a career that's very intrinsic to their identity, but Jack's is threatened by writer's block and alcoholism. He's fired from his teaching job, becomes increasingly emotionally and physically disconnected from his family. We see that even Will, with this glittering Pulitzer Prize winning career, has had it absolutely poisoned by his choice to photograph rather than save a dying girl, and a career that means that he's never at home. He's an absentee husband and father. So yes, they both take their families to a new quasi-domestic space. Jack to the Overlook, where he can avoid temptation. Will Davidson goes to this very traditional American dream home to play the part of husband and father. But what both of them find, and certainly Will Davidson to a great extreme, is that the minute they enter these homes, they become really sentient and manipulative in very terrifying ways. The spaces are always expanding and contracting, and both of these protagonists are literally and metaphorically swallowed by what the Gothic writer Stephen Graham Jones calls the hungry house. So in The Shining, the hotel sets out to disorient Jack with endless corridors and time slips, the presence of ghostly staff to sort of expose his flaws and tempt him. He wants to be a good father, but somehow struggles to reconcile traditional 50s values with new ideas emerging from the 1970s. When we look at Will Davidson, when he goes to his new home that embodies all these typical American dream ideals, he thinks it's going to be, and I quote, a cozy little outpost. He thinks he's going to sit on the porch and drink lemonade. But he finds that one day a brand new empty grey-black closet opens up in his bedroom, and it's physically too big to actually fit inside his house. And when this develops into this horrible featureless underworld of staircases and corridors and empty windowless rooms, it becomes ever more terrifying, to the point where he is forbidden to enter by his wife. When he sends other people in to explore it and map it, they are simply sent into a psychotic breakdown. And in order to tempt him in, the house is forced to literally swallow his twin brother. So these spaces become really interesting. And in order to think about their nature and function, I've been referencing The Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelard, and he set out to kind of create a taxonomy of literary rooms and look at their function. And although he usually errs on the side of positive representations, he does reference quite a lot of Gothic literature, including Poe. And it's interesting that the closet as a beginning point in the House of Leaves is what Bachelard would associate with a sense of order and identity. And so this new space that erupts implies disorder from the very outset. If we look at the fact that this space has many floors and many levels and many staircases for Bachelard are always heading down to cellars. And these are places that he actually says, and I quote, create an anthropocosmic fear. And this, coupled with all these functionless empty rooms, suggests that, you know, this is a home that is representing something that is deeply disordered. So these rooms trap people into these really, really disoriented journeys, and Will is left in a horrible sense of existential crisis, and he loses all sense of time and space, and ultimately has to be rescued by his wife. What these post-millennial narratives, if we look at some of the stories that come after this, we start to see the development of this almost cosmological fear being developed. In House of Leaves, geological tests suggest that the house itself, the walls of the house, are nearly 4.7 billion years old. And there's a suggestion that, I quote, the origins are interplanetary, interstellar perhaps. And when you track the texts that follow on from House of Leaves, you can see, if you've read Steve Ratchford Thames' short story Twember, it's a story that describes huge geological strata moving through the landscape to destroy towns and homes. In Jack Jemp's The Grip of It, the house is connected to the roots of the forest and the local cave system. In Keith Lee Morris's Traveller's Rest, the hotel where the characters are trapped is linked by this really bizarre system of bridges and stairways above ground and underground via a mine shaft. So my argument is that what seems to be going on here with this proliferation of this particular trope is that there's a representation of American masculinity that seems to be in a state of complete collapse. And you can argue that it's always been this. You know, Mitchell Weir was prescribing the dude ranch cure back in the 19th century to counter the feared feminization of men caused by the Industrial Revolution. But this current trauma seems to run a lot deeper. Susan Faludi, in her book Stiff, tracks the post-World War II decline in manufacturing, the resulting job losses and marriage breakdowns that mean that working and middle-class men no longer feel they have, and I quote, a useful role in public life, a way of earning a decent, reliable living, appreciation in the home, and respectful treatment in the culture. Faludi's Stiff, Hannah Roslin's The End of Men, Michael Kimmel's Angry White Men paint this really bleak picture of an American middle and working class manhood that's utterly lost and for whom there is no way back. All their theatres of performance have been taken from them. Pioneers breaking the wilderness, workers in the manufacturing industries as heads of family. But what's really interesting is that even though they paint a way of, there is no way of going back, this new strand of Gothic, the narratives always seem to conclude with some sense of survival, certainly the ones post-millennial. So the narrative endings of this new trope can really not be described as happy. They certainly conclude with survival. But the flip is of this, that even though they survive, somehow this is where the new terror seems to begin. So at the very end of the story of Will Naverton and the house at Ash Tree Lane, we see this particular ending, and Will Naverton is actually filming his kids taking part in trick-or-treating. He's escaped the house, he's restored his family fantasy, and he films the kids trick-or-treating, but he captures that empty road disappearing into the woods as a street lamp flickers out and darkness sweeps in like a hand. So this trope seems to be setting out to produce a kind of almost nihilistic fear, and the price for survival for the male protagonist is this realization that he might have survived, but he's been deluded, and that although he can retrieve this family fantasy, what he can't ever restore is this sense that he is always subject to the whims of fate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kerry, for such fascinating and engaging presentation. So I'm going to present our next speaker now, Andrew, if you're ready. Andrew Sidlick is an independent scholar with a PhD in English literature from the Ohio State University, and he is interested in researching disability in horror genres. Today, he is presenting a paper entitled Share the Trauma, the house as transmitter of disability and psychic pain in The Dark and the Wicked and Relic. So if you're ready, Andrew, the floor is yours. I think you've got to...
okay, am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Let me just pull up my paper here. Okay, so, to put it bluntly, we have all been traumatized in the last few years. We've lived through a global pandemic, political unrest, and growing economic inequality. I am approaching trauma as a severely disruptive experience that profoundly impacts the self's structural organization and perception of the external world. My analysis today is through the lenses of trauma and disability studies, fields that examine the social forces that shape trauma and disability, locating them in the social world rather than within individuals. The two 2020 horror films that I'm talking about today, The Dark and the Wicked and Relic, in these films, the trauma of abandonment in rural homes causes others to experience the psychic pain and disabilities of those who have been abandoned. These films revise the traditional Gothic trope of family dysfunction to explore larger anxieties of how the dysfunctional home reflects aging, loss of physical and mental disabilities, and ability to cope with the painful realities of caregiving. In both films, an older parent falls ill and their adult children come home to care for them. Although somewhat estranged from their parents, taking on this caregiving role transforms them into receivers for the fear and pain that their parents have been experiencing. Otherworldly forces transform the home into a frightening, wounding place, a site of trauma. Both The Dark and the Wicked and Relic actually differ in how their characters respond to this reconfiguration of home. One is a terrifying vision of a broken family in the rural United States. The other is a story of empathy and understanding in an Australian home made unfamiliar to an elderly woman living with dementia. The Dark and the Wicked, set in Thurber, Texas, paints a bleak portrait of home and fractured family connections. Siblings Michael and Louise return to the family farm when their father David becomes bedridden, unable to move or to communicate. Their mother Virginia tells them to leave, believing that some kind of demonic presence is after her husband's soul. This evil presence, which remains ambiguous throughout the film, terrorizes and destroys everyone who comes in or near the home. But this is through psychological rather than physical attacks, appearing in the guises of others who are known to them to inspire guilt and grief until these people kill themselves to escape the pain. The mother falls victim first. She hangs herself in the barn, and the demon later appears in her guise several times, singing aptly, "What a friend we have in Jesus." The demon makes Michael and Louise feel responsible for the pain around them, and home is turned into a source of trauma. The trauma here is triggered by David's complete paralysis, an event that left Virginia heartbroken on a struggling farm where the couple has been left behind by their children with only the help of an older farmhand. David's illness is never really explained, and so it's probably brought on by the demon in order to send events into motion. Just as his comatose state leaves him unable to communicate, so throughout the film, other characters struggle to communicate and more often than not fail in their attempts. Ironically, these failures are brought on by their own fears of abandonment. The fractured rural family in The Dark and the Wicked reflects the hardships of the rural American home in the 21st century. According to the CDC, rural Americans experienced suicide at higher rates than those living in urban areas, and this gap has only been increasing since 2007. Rural people are not given the support from government when local churches or family can't meet their needs. According to Jennifer Sherman, crises such as, quote, rapid industrial decline, severe job loss, and persistent poverty, unquote, have beset rural American communities. Although they live in less densely populated areas, rural Americans have been hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. North Dakota, one of the least populated states, at one time had the highest mortality rate in the world from the virus at 18.2 deaths per million. Despite strong family-oriented values, many rural homes have been threatened by financial and medical misfortunes. Commitment to family obligations is one of the strengths of rural America. Support there is often local rather than state or federal, but for many rural communities, local support is not enough, especially as more of the younger generations move to find better opportunities. Michael and Louise represent those who have left their rural homes behind. They struggle to fulfill their sense of duty to family, but their limited displays of affection cannot save their parents. As they chat the night after they arrive back at the farm, they have awkward and a brief conversation in which it becomes clear that they don't really know how to communicate and they haven't talked to each other or to their parents in months. After Virginia later kills herself, Louise and Michael learn that she had been talking to someone who wasn't there. Louise asks who she might have been talking to, and Michael, clearly uncomfortable with the topic, says not to think about it because she was too ill to know what she was doing. Louise, is racked by guilt and insists that they should have helped her. We should have done something, hugged her, something. Michael responds, yeah, because that would have made everything better, probably. Louise wants them to admit some responsibility for their mother's death, but Michael doesn't want to address it. They cannot ignore, however, the demon's presence as more people die throughout the film. As the evil manifests itself, their reluctant acceptance of the demon's reality figuratively stands in for the acceptance of the hardship and pain that now pervades their home. But Michael still cannot fully cope with this reality. He tells Louise, I wanted to feel something. Now I just want to forget this place. After seeing a vision of his dead naked mother singing, "What a friend we have in Jesus," he flees, leaving Louise behind. He claims that his first responsibility is to his own family, to his wife and daughter, not to Louise or to their father, whom immobile, essentially comatose, he considers to be pretty much already dead. When he does come home, he cannot escape the trauma of the family farm, even though he does what most of us scream at characters in horror movies to do. He gets out of the damn house. But when he gets back to where he lives with his wife and daughters, he sees a vision of them dead. This is an illusion, but he feels in despair, and he ends up cutting his own throat. Louise, meanwhile, back at the farm, vows to stay by her father's side, saying, I love you, I won't leave you, don't leave me. But this declaration of love is not enough, and he dies. And as he dies, Louise hears her mother singing again, "What a friend we have in Jesus," just before the demon attacks. The words of this song throughout the film ironically reflect the absence of companionship, reminding us that Virginia and David have been friendless, left behind and abandoned by their children until now. And even the name of the town, which is only mentioned briefly, but the real Thurber, Texas, is a literal ghost town. It was once a thriving coal and oil company town, but it was completely abandoned when the company moved away. In contrast, the Australian movie Relic provides a loving, if still unsettling, depiction of sharing trauma and disability. Edna, suffering from dementia, disappears for a few days. So her daughter Kay and her grandchild Sam come to search for her. When Edna returns, she is dirty and bruised with no memory of where she had been. There are noticeable tensions between Edna and Kay, as well as between Kay and Sam. Similar to The Dark and the Wicked, the family is somewhat estranged, and attempts at communication devolve into passive-aggressive exchanges. Kay decides that her mother's cognitive impairments are too severe, and so she searches for a nursing home to move her to. Relic plays out an obvious metaphor about how aging, isolation, and cognitive disability can literally take over your life and transform your home into something unfamiliar, something uncanny. As Edna's behavior becomes increasingly unpredictable, a black mold spreads over the house as well as over Edna's body. Sam finds a secret passageway in the house, a moldy and ever-changing double of the original house. Similar to House of Leaves, its hallways narrow to claustrophobic and impassable spaces, and open passages become walls where Sam tries to turn back. Sam feels the same sense of isolation and confusion that Edna felt when living alone with dementia. To make matters worse, Edna finds Sam in there, her body bending and contorting unnaturally. And as she chases Sam and Kay until they find their way back to the original house. But rather than simply triggering fears of the uncanny old person monster, Edna's transformation evokes compassion as well. As Edna becomes immobile and unable to speak, much like David in The Dark and the Wicked, Kay gingerly picks her up and carries her to bed, culminating in a startling body horror visual. Kay tenderly peels off Edna's skin piece by piece to reveal a black, hairless form, as if the mold pervading the house has taken a human shape. But the horror is undercut by the love between them as Edna and Kay lay beside each other and Sam comes in to reluctantly join them. The trauma in Relic is not Edna's aging, but a horrific family legacy of abandonment. Kay tells Sam of a cabin on the land where Kay's great-grandfather was kept when he became elderly and ill. He was so neglected that when he died, they didn't find his body until months later, when his body had decomposed into the floor. When the cabin was torn down, one of the windows was installed into the front door of the house, and this window is the source of the mold. Thus, home transmits the original abandonment down through the generations. Both The Dark and the Wicked and Relic show how neglect and lack of support can lead to trauma and disability. Further, both movies powerfully illustrate how impairments affect not only the individual, but everyone around them. These Gothic horror stories depict rural homes as places not just to witness disability and pain, but also to share those experiences. In The Dark and the Wicked, Michael and Louise gesture towards empathy and love, but are unable to truly understand the trauma their parents have experienced. The failure of understanding hints at the rugged individualism espoused by many rural Americans who believe they can conquer adversity on their own and resist admitting to any vulnerability. In contrast, Relic's director Natalie Erica James was inspired by her own experiences caring for her grandmother living with Alzheimer's. Rather than demonizing people with dementia, she wanted to show how living with dementia affects the entire family. We are left with two visions of sharing trauma, disability, and pain. One in which sharing erases the distance between loved ones no longer sharing a physical home, and one in which it tears them apart with no hope of survival. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Such a wonderful presentation. And last but not least, I'll introduce Marko. Marko Lukic is an associate professor at the English department of the University of Zadar in Croatia. His research interests include American popular culture, space and literature and film, and contemporary horror. His talk for today is titled Housing the Dead, Reinventing Post-Apocalyptic Domesticity. So the floor is yours, Marko.
Thank you very much. Okay, so with the house being a traditionally popular horror trope and the locus of innumerable storylines, it is no wonder that zombie narratives followed a similar pattern. Starting, for example, with George Romero and the Night of the Living Dead, the viewers are almost immediately introduced to a farmhouse, a space which requires the quality of a safe location. However, the presented space remains somewhat two-dimensional, or more precisely, it fails to develop beyond the notion of a setting. The failure to spatially evolve is caused mostly by Romero's insistence on constructing and presenting the house as a metaphor, whose purpose is to provide a symbolic articulation of the American dream and the initial phases of its deconstruction, the disappearing family values, the impending sexual revolution, racial issues, and so on, rather than to explore the actual spatial qualities. Or, to sort of theoretically contextualize it within the work presented by human geographer E. Foutuan, Romero fails at portraying the transition from space to place, with space, in very generalized terms, obviously, representing an abstract concept such as outer space or the spaces in geometry, spaces which with certain areas and volumes, and place being the consequence of an emotional inscription into these spaces. The house, therefore, within Romero's narrative, retains a sort of simplistic function of a setting. The domestic surroundings within Robert Kirkman's The Walking Dead, on the other hand, function in a somewhat different and more, let's say, intimate way. At first, it is a space of safety, or as Gaston Bachelard will define it, as sites of our intimate lives, our first universe, a group of organic habits. The home is therefore a safety zone, a purposely confining space that we can experience, or while acting as viewers, that we can easily identify with. By following the character of Rick Grimes, what we are offered is not Romero's vision of the house as an accumulation of cultural social symbols, but it is instead a familiar setting, now warped and destroyed by the occurred apocalypse. Nevertheless, it still retains the detailed familiarity that makes it a home. Frame by frame, regardless if you observe the comic panel or a video segment, we are exposed to the abandoned bedrooms of the house, living rooms, family portraits, together with numerous other details, as well as the angst and sorrow accompanying the ongoing realization of the main character that the notion of his once familiar and safe place is rapidly dissolving in front of him. To a certain extent, we can even argue that an inverted spatial transmutation is occurring through an emotional purge of the once familiar context of the home. A similar deconstructing moment can be observed during the 5th season of the series. The 9th episode of the season, titled What Happened and What's Going On, once again revisits the continuous need of the wandering group of survivors to find safety in a new home and to rebuild the now lost place of intimacy. Once again, this spatial experience can be contextualized within Tuan's organization and understanding of space. Tuan talks about front spaces and back spaces in relation to a home, with front spaces being almost always public, functioning as a sort of stage, while the back spaces, bedrooms, guest rooms, project a sense of concealment and invisibility. These rooms are implicitly our spaces of intimacy where one can feel completely safe and relaxed. To cut it short, one of the characters exploring the house, starting with the front space, the living room, where he finds a dead body. He then slowly continues to move away from the living room towards the bedroom located obviously in the back segment of the house, allowing the viewers to become aware of the almost measurable penetration into the intimacy of the house and the family that lived there. While Grimes, for a brief moment, experiences what was once his inner sanctum, only to continue his search for other survivors, Tyrese, the character of the episode, explores what was initially left unarticulated. He reaches the children's bedroom, where he finds one child dead, while the other attacks him, sealing his fate, obviously, with a bite. Although the portrayed attack does not differ from numerous other similar zombie attacks, the spatial context is an extraordinary one, with Tyrese becoming fully aware of the decomposing nature of what was once home. The second spatial paradigm that can be observed, once again in relation to the concept of the house and domesticity, imposes itself almost as a logical consequence to the previously evidenced spatial deconstruction. Starting once again with Rick Grimes and his realization that the home he once had is now gone, the viewers or the readers become involved in his travels and attempts to cope with and survive in the new post-apocalyptic setting. Although countless seasons and issues sort of presented his misadventures over the years, a very adequate and eerie summarization of his experiences can be observed through the very specific intros to the show. The introduction consists of a sequence of grainy, washed-out segments, alternatively portraying family photographs, newspaper clippings, and similar, followed by a progressive series of images, rapidly escalating from an initially domestic context towards houses in general, schools, hospitals, urban centers, and finally stopping with an overview of a city with its outbound and inbound highway lines. Each of these frames functions as a Bachelardian spatial alveoli, or in other words, as a potential experience and memory. Each potential memory, in turn, when placed within a particular spatial context, is simultaneously also located at the verge to become a place. But this proposed transformation, the inscription of meaning, remains unaccomplished. What remains, as Marko, for example, argues, is nothing more than a type of perpetually promising tourism leaflet. What we are left with is the position of what Auger describes as a traveler who functions as an observer of a sequence of events and of a succession of partial glimpses, a series of snapshots, which become piled hurriedly into the memory of the traveler. Auger further proposes the idea of non-places, specifically a space which cannot be defined as relational or historical or concerned with an identity. The proposed spatial paradigm and the accompanying experience of the traveler is therefore cleverly shared by both the viewers and the characters. The notion of the traveler and its perception of the surroundings while moving and the simultaneously moving surroundings frames the multi-discursive spatial problematic of the introduction. It clearly indicates the now obvious detachment of the characters from what was once their home, and by doing that, deconstructs the complex symbolical network of meaning formerly embodied in the imagery or place of a home or a house, while simultaneously infringing the fourth wall and allowing the viewers to actively partake in the role of the traveler, and by doing that, sharing with the protagonist the previously mentioned tourism leaflet experience. Furthermore, the familiarity of the home, the safety of a house, the almost poetic romanticizing of the provided safety is now made completely sterile and distant due to the complete degeneration of the initial domestic space place. The trigger for this is the unstoppable rise of the monsters, which, regardless of the indisputable otherness embodied in the decaying bodies of the walking dead, still retains the once known intimacy. As opposed to many other monsters, the zombie retain a particular intimate quality, precisely due to its rebirthing context. Reborn in intimacy as someone's spouse, sister, father, or child, the zombie simultaneously embodies its monstrous nature, as well as the familiarity associated with the construction of a home or a place. The gravitational pull of the home, therefore, includes all of its elements of familiarity and memories, while the zombies, once family members and the living articulation of familiar surroundings, are now nothing more than Walking Dead memories, or, reflecting on Bachelard's analysis, the now Walking Dead spatial alveoli. By following the notion of strength and safety being achieved through numbers, the continuously repurposed wandering group of survivors is constantly searching for larger groups of people, but also for a secure location or a new home where they could start rebuilding their lives. This is the moment that marks the beginning of the third spatial paradigm, the formation of what could be defined as a neoliberal construct or even a state. Following David Harvey's debate regarding capitalism and globalization and neoliberalism, as an interesting observation can be made regarding the similarities of globalization as an all-equating system with the post-apocalyptic spaces represented in zombie narratives. The once diversified world is now unified in a unique paradigm of violence, while individualism, once moderated through various forms of consumerist off-job control, to quote Chomsky, now becomes an imperative. The similarities between post-apocalyptic space and the formation of a neoliberal system continues with the attempts of the characters to establish a proto-society whose main purpose is the protection and the accumulation of goods. Domesticity and intimacy are no longer a priority. Economy becomes imperative. What follows is the structuring of a new type of domesticity premised on a neoliberal spatial paradigm and articulated in three segments. As stated by Harvey, the first notion is the stressing of the individual entrepreneurial freedoms, which in turn means no social or political regulatory structures. This is one of the main features of the post-apocalyptic world as portrayed in The Walking Dead. With only the personal interests of particular groups as potential regulatory guidelines, with no external supervision and control, the individual freedoms do not only contribute to the construction of an extreme version of a neoliberal state, but it becomes its most prominent characteristic. Whether the analyzed actions are those of the supposedly benign group led by Rick Grimes, or the explicitly violent acts done by the group ironically named Saviors and led by Negan, the presented behavior of both the groups is equally not extended towards anybody outside of the initial group. The second and the third instance, as proposed once again by Harvey, focus on both on private property rights as well as free market and the basic infrastructure guaranteed by society. Both instances are presented within the narrative through the tendency of characters and groups to physically protect their private properties and to propagate free market, under quotation marks, through the simple use of violence. This is accompanied by an adequate infrastructure offered by the post-apocalyptic proto-society, which can be summoned up to strength in numbers and superior firepower. We can conclude by going back once again to Rick Grimes and him stating, "We do what we need to do and then we get to live. But no matter what we find in DC, I know we'll be okay because this is how we survive. We tell ourselves that we are the walking dead." With that, we become aware of the obvious otherness of the characters, dominantly based on the prowess towards violence. But in addition to that, we become even more aware of the inability of the now changed characters to emotionally project towards anything or anyone outside of their group. Their existence, now conforming to a neoliberal space and experience, and coinciding to the continuously moving map of neoliberalization, allows and forces them to experience always new spaces. Yet these spaces remain just that, spaces, defined by the unceasingly violent behavior of the characters, whose inability for any consistent inscription of meaning perpetually prevents them from the recreation of place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marko. Such a good presentation, very interesting topic. So, well, this has been such a great panel. I'm really honored to be chairing it. So now I think we're a bit short on time, so it's time for the question and answer session. So maybe we had time for a couple of questions or just some comments. I can see a raised hand by Anna, so you can ask your question now.
It was very interesting. I actually have a couple of questions that are from Paul Mitchell, who is another participant in the conference, and he really wanted to attend today, but he couldn't because of something came up. So he asked me if I could please pass on his questions. And one is directed to Andrew. And he says, I would like to know if you think that Gothic writers and filmmakers need to do more to offer affirmative views of disability that are in line with critical disability theory. So not just the view of disability as being disabling or associated with negative behaviors. And then there's one that is for all of you. Just a few words on this, if you wish. He says, I'd like to know if the speakers think that the House Gothic Association remains focused on female experience, or if nowadays it has become a site for more nuanced explorations of male experience, which is more or less what I think Kerry was going about. So maybe if Andrew wants to answer the first one, and then you can just give a few words on the second question. Thank you.
Sure. So if I capture the question correctly about whether Gothic writers and filmmakers should show more affirming depictions of disability, the short answer is yes. You know, disability is quite common in the Gothic and horror. And there's, a lot of the depictions, even going back to the very earliest, even if we're going back into the 19th century with Poe, or even late 18th with Charles Brockden Brown, mental illness is associated with violence, physical deformity is associated with violence. We often get those kinds of things, but there's also a lot of ways that you can read those texts. You can read some tensions into them, where those depictions are actually ways of putting a lens back on, on the failures of the social world, on the negative things within the world, not just the individual. And so that's kind of where I was going with my paper. But a lot of times it's very hard you have to do a lot of effort as a viewer in order to tease out those readings. I think in recent times, we're seeing more and more positive perspectives as people gain a better sense of disability awareness, of disability like other forms of identity, such as race, sexuality, gender, as a cultural identity. And we're seeing, I think Relic is a good example of this, where we see a way in which we can explore some of the difficulties of living with disability, but also explore the ways in which, we can also have positive experiences with people with disabilities. So I think it's something that's slowly but surely coming into the genre.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that was maybe what he was trying to say indeed. And I do agree that definitely it's kind of hard to find that many cultural products in which we do see different facets of disability. What is your everyday life of these characters? Usually we don't really see that. Usually right. It's always focused. I think there's also sometimes, I think, this sort of empathic lens that not necessarily is a lens that is going to tell us how a person actually lives with disability in their everyday lives, So I think that definitely is changing, maybe still kind of slowly.
Yes.
So thank you. And maybe the second.
Maybe the second question, if someone wants to start.
I wouldn't mind sort of chipping in on the whole idea of the Gothic house as a domestic space. I think it's really interesting that so many of us have referenced Poe and Hawthorne and Brockden Brown, because we go back and we look at things like the Black Cat, and you can see the domestic space kind of being occupied very much by men. And certainly over the last 10 years, the focus has been on the house as a maternal space, and we can think of Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. But there does seem to have been this line, this trope developing that seems to reflect the displacement of men from the house. So we're putting men back in the house because they've been so significantly displaced. And I think one of the interesting things at the moment is that the development of technology, and particularly during the pandemic, what's really interesting is, and I think why perhaps we're seeing men more in the Gothic domestic space, is that the home has also become the workplace, because we're sitting in a home that is also our office. And I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens after the pandemic, when people maybe continue to work from home, whether we start to see this trope sort of continue to develop and extend. So for me at the moment, there's definitely this line of what happens when you try and put men back into the domestic sphere, out of the public and back into the private.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Kerry. And just to add on that, I do think that we're past that moment of this immediate association of the home with women. But also women still do most of the housework, women still do most of the caring work, women still do most of those tasks related to the house in one way or another. So I think that not until we get over the sexist division of work will this stop being an issue. But having said that, obviously masculinities can also be studied through the theme of Gothic houses, as Kerry's excellent presentation has shown. Yeah, thanks, Paul, virtually, for your questions.
Is there any other comment about this last question?
Maybe I could.
If you want, yeah.
No, but I mean, it depends. I mean, if you are talking about the position of men within the house and domesticity in real life, then it's one discourse. Within the horror genre, I think has been past quite a decade or so, there has been certain changes been done. I mean, just think about, for example, the American Horror Story, the first season. Just the first thing that pops in my mind. Some other, but even if you go further back, maybe there's not that much repositioning of male characters within, but there's also no repressing women by positioning them within domestic context. Even if they're there, they manage to fight back and fight through and get out of it, and not necessarily through the paradigm of a final girl. I think it's just a matter of sort of creating new content and offering something new, which hasn't been done in recent years. They're just rehashing this and that, and the best they can do, and the best thing that they usually do, is just either gender swap or race swaps, and that's about it. Okay, so they should produce something original and recalibrate themselves in relation to contemporary trends and contemporary narratives. What's been done so far, I don't think it's remarkable in any possible way. It's kind of basic and plain and repetitive.
Yes, thank you for your answer.
Thank you. I'm sure that Paul will be happy to hear your answers, even if he couldn't be here. And I'm sure he will watch the recording as soon as it's out. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Anna. Is there any other question? You can use your raise hand button on the Zoom tools bar, or if there was any other comment by the speakers about this last question. Laura is raising her virtual hand.
Hi, can you hear me properly? Okay.
Yep.
So my question was, because I think something that kind of all of you covered is this idea of capitalism, and Sofía was talking about the house in the suburban space. You were relating it, and kind of to relate it also to Paul's question about the role of the women in the house. I was wondering more about the role of the social status, so to speak. So how if there are different ways in which the Gothic or the Gothic house specifically is depicted in different ways according to how the economic structure or the ills of the economic situation of the families that inhabit these houses or that go to these houses affects that representation. And I hope that made sense.
Yes, does anyone want to start?
I can. So I think the suburban house is a perfect example of what you're asking, because it specifically embodies the middle class aspirations, of the white heteronormative family. So yeah, I do think that there's definitely that connection between the economic status of who is to inhabit this space and the problems that it can entail, and those problems is what leads culture to treat it in Gothic terms, if that makes sense. How problematic it is to depict these spaces, or to promote these spaces as like a specific realm for a certain demographic, in short.
Very interesting answer. Is there any other comment? If that is everything. I think, yes. Do you want to add something, Laura?
Yeah, I was gonna add that maybe I was also thinking in terms of how it comes from the origin of the Gothic house and how it's usually associated with the decay of the horror mansion type of thing. And maybe I was wondering if any of you want to come in and comment something, how if in the contemporary narratives and contemporary films that are done in these terms as a critique of capitalism or individualism, especially in the US, also work toward this kind of reparations of recovering a certain order, or is it just a form of criticism of that economic situation?
I'd quite like to add something there, if that would be okay. I was just thinking when you were speaking of Steve Frasnick's Thamesstead Fall Hotel, and that is a hotel which is described as being endlessly added to and added to and added to. Yeah, it's always decaying, it's always falling down, bits of it are out of use, bits of it only appear every now and again. And it just seems to reflect this idea that American systems are, you know, never properly considered, never properly reorganized, and that everything is just a sticking plaster on another wound, on another wound, on another wound, and that everything is always in constant danger of collapse. And he actually expresses the whole hotel as a kind of diseased and infested and parasitic body. So that might be an example that would kind of fit with what you're thinking about as the house of a representation of capitalist state. So that would be the text that I would offer up that really supports that.
Thank you very much, Kerry. That's very interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, I was also thinking, if I may add something, I think something that pervaded all of your talks, maybe just tangentially, but it was there. It's also the idea of democracy as something pertaining to the United States, or something, or the United States being the bastion of democracy. That's an idea that's been present from the Revolutionary War through the expansion to the West, Civil War, World War II, the Cold War. And yeah, it's true that democracy is something very valuable that we should keep. But I've also realized, studying the history of the United States and cultural productions in the United States, that whenever democracy is imperiled from the outside or from the inside, the responses have been paranoid to an extent that they also imperil democracy. And I think all these works that you've been mentioning can also be read as houses of democracy, in a sense that they're also crumbling. They're not in the works that Bernice Murphy analyzes. Also, they're not well built. They're not in the place where they should be. So I think that also goes hand in hand with American capitalism and neoliberalism. And I think that's also I've perceived in all your talks. And I don't know if anyone wants to add something just to wrap up.
Yeah, maybe if I could.
Of course, yeah.
I think it works. I think that horror in itself, or Gothic, whatever you want to use as a term, it sort of lives in those cracks. It lives in the cracks of democracy. It lives in the cracks of all that, but it feeds on it, and it feeds it. But now the question I think that needs to be asked there, the research that needs to be done is whether these authors are applauding the issue of democracy is sort of falling apart in Kremlin. To a certain extent they do, because they're making money off of it, so at least something. Or is it an attempt, like a proactive attempt of, let's think about these things and let's question, whether we should behave in a different way. I think things changed when we talk about, I mentioned Romero, but for example, Romero, because he's interesting in relation to consumerism at the beginning of this neoliberal discourse. He and that specific, let's say, horror section of the late 60s, 70s, and so forth, American production mostly, it functions as a warning, as sort of a warning sign or warning message against some possible future that could come. Nowadays, if you look at, I don't know, The Purge, for example, or if you look some other narratives that have been created in the past decade, or so. I'm not sure there is much of a warning message there, or it's not. There's not even. I think there's not even a hint of critique. It's just presented as plain and factual, right? So it becomes a little bit more problematic, I would say, in contemporary terms, and in relation to this democracy. In the sense, are they promoting an idea of democracy, what the state should go back to? I'm talking about states because I'm mostly focused on them. Or are they actually making these liberal statements depending on the political option and direction and so forth, sort of leaning towards a deconstruction, possible deconstruction of democracy, or democracy as it was perceived previously, right?
You're completely right. I think it was in one of the keynote interviews that we've done, I think it was Jeffrey Weinstock, that he mentioned that the Gothic does not necessarily mean a transgression of the norm. Sometimes it's a reinforcement of it, and I was really surprised because it's an approach that we ignore sometimes, and I loved it, and I think it resonates with what you've said. I don't know if the rest of the speakers agree or not. Or just, yeah, it just depends. It does not follow a single template. Yeah, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, well, actually, just what you ended with there, I mean, I think it really depends from case to case, but just kind of going off on a number of comments that have come already. I mean, I think that what I get from the Gothic and horror is I do see them, the creators, as kind of sort of putting a magnifying glass, if you will, up to a lot of the issues that we are seeing, and not. I mean, I do think that a lot of them either are intentionally or unintentionally, critiquing a lot of these things, but then perhaps also unwittingly reinforcing them. I mean, it's similar with disability, in some ways trying to put an empathetic lens, but then also reinforcing some of the stereotypes. And I think as far as, the concept of democracy, I mean, running throughout the Gothic, through the earliest American Gothic, I mean, I think one of the things that it's pointing out is one of the most dangerous concepts, at least to me. Maybe this is biased by my interest in disability, but one of the most dangerous ideas of American culture since the United States became a country is this sense of the individual, of individualism, because I mean, democracy is about the people, right? It's a communal idea. It's an idea of collective action and change. And when you have this idea of the individual can do everything, the individual, the value is placed in the individual's ability to be a proper citizen, a proper capitalist, producer and consumer. For disabled people, obviously that is a lot of times an issue when they rely on other people for accommodations, for assistance. But just in general, I mean, I think you see that again and again where it's, in the films I presented on, where the critique is held up to this sense of, I don't need others to help me. I can do it on my own. And that's just, whether it's because of disability, whether it's because of, racial or gender disparities, or whether it's just a product of pure economic status, all these things, we realize that democracy cannot happen if we are stuck in this idea of the individual. And that's just been, I think there's always been this tension in American politics and culture between this sense of we are united as a nation, but we are also the individual who can do everything on our own. And I think the Gothic has been one of the most powerful critics compared to other genres of that concept.
Yeah, it's a wonderful conclusion. I think we've, we're running out of time. I think we've extended this session more than we were supposed to, but this was such an interesting, intellectually rich discussion, great Q&A session, and yeah, Andrew's comment, I think it wraps everything up perfectly and offers a great conclusion. So I'd just like to thank our speakers. I'm really honored to have shared this space with you today. And of course, our public, everyone who's accompanied us today, and the organization of this conference, which all of them have been working really hard over the last few months. So I thank you again. I'll give you a virtual platform here now. And yes, I'd love to see you in person, virtually again at some further occasions. So just, I'll repeat it one more time. Thank you very much. This has been a delightful session.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
We'll close the session now.
Bye-bye.